My name is Jay Bruns. I'm on the board of the World Affairs Council of America as well as on the Connecticut board, and it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce both of our speakers today, or our speaker and our moderator, I should say. First, I want to say that Google is a major sponsor of the World Affairs Council of America, and as many of you know, has offered to do a program that some of our councils will be able to benefit from in the coming year. It's my great pleasure to introduce David Drummond, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Legal Officer for Google. David has been with Google since virtually the beginning, because he was there when I got to know the founders when it really first started. And so he is in a very, very good position to talk about, from Google's perspective, how the internet has changed freedom and the challenges still that the internet faces when it is regulated in a fair portion of the world's population, because many governments do continue to regulate the internet. Here to moderate, we are very pleased to welcome back someone who I think is known to almost everyone in the room, Ambassador John Negroponte, who currently is Vice Chairman of McLarty Associates, Operation McLarty Associates. And he really needs no introduction, but as you know, as many of you know, he has been ambassador to Honduras, Mexico, Philippines, United Nations, and Iraq. He was Deputy National Security Advisor under President Reagan. He was the country's first Director of National Intelligence under President George W. Bush. And he was also the Deputy Secretary of State for a while, and had many other very interesting posts. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator and look forward to a fascinating talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mic check, are we okay? Great. Well, I'm delighted to be able to moderate and contribute in some modest way to this conversation. And even more delighted that our speaker this afternoon is David Drummond, who's already been introduced as General Counsel, Senior Vice President of Google. I guess the one other observation I would make from reading your curriculum vitae, Dean Acheson, noted Secretary of State of the United States, once wrote a book about his tenure as Secretary of State, and it was called Present at the Creation. And I think we can say quite safely that David Drummond was present at the creation of Google, and which is my signature's on the document. So we're delighted to welcome you here, and I have a number of questions I'd like to ask you, and in the time available, maybe we have a little bit of a conversation and open the floor to questions. But my first question is, the title of this session is Freedom and Power in the Digital Age. That is assuming that freedom and power have changed since the proliferation of digital technology. So what is the major difference today with the internet as compared to times past?
Sure, it's a great question. And let me first say, I'm really happy to be here. I've really been familiar with the World Affairs Council for many years.
Excuse me, could you just elevate that or move your chair a little bit, because we can't hear on
No,
here.
it's not a chair question, it's just whether the mic is. How about that? Is that better? I think my mic's too far down my thigh. My apologies. From Silicon Valley, we don't wear these, sir. Bear with me there. But I have been familiar with the World Affairs Council for many years, and from the Bay Area, and have attended vineyards over a while when I was in school, I believe, World Affairs Council event. So very happy to be here and happy that Google is providing support. So on the question of freedom and power, there's no question in our minds that the balance of power and freedom and individual freedom has changed with the advent of technology and the internet and all of the tools that are available. I think information, communication, control of that used to be the province of the elites, governments and people who had power. And I think that there's a hugely liberating element to technology. We've seen this in democratic revolutions around the world in the past few years, that now everyone can get access to information provided, and we'll get into this, provided the government allows them to, and everyone can publish, communicate with others using international tools that cross traditional borders. So there has been, there's no question that freedom has been enhanced in a lot of ways for individuals to the internet. It's also true, however, that power has been enhanced for governments. And so for every example you can talk about in terms of a movement, a democratic movement, or individuals pushing back against injustices and using the internet to do that, you have examples of governments, repressive governments, and others who are trying to control people also using technology in order to do that. And so we've got sometimes people on the internet get a little carried away and have this kind of utopian view that it's all good. In fact, it's changed, but there's still the use of technology by governments to control, in many cases, and individuals
So, what is actually changing? Is it the tools that are making the individuals more powerful? And is the state still in control in some respects?
Yeah, the state is still in control. I mean, states have guns, they can put people in jail, and they still do. But take an example. The Arab Spring was clearly an example of this. But using things like Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube to organize, for instance, you can do that before. Very hard. Organize. Get people on the internet. You can communicate with each other. Tell people where the demonstration is going to be. Rally people. Then people can take videos of what's going on and then put it up for all the world to see with a cell phone. Right? That's a big change, right? In terms of documenting what's going on, documenting what the government does. That's a big change. Right? Now, again, one of those stories there are counter stories. Right? One of the things that people are very excited about, that have been excited about for the past few years in Silicon Valley, is crowdsourcing. The idea that you can get by going out to the public and internet users, they can contribute information that makes things more interesting. And you look at the Iranian regime, for instance, when they were trying to crack down on dissidents, one of the things that they did that was very clever was to say, we've taken pictures of people at these rallies. You want to know who they are, they put them up on the internet, right? And let people who were sympathetic to the regime, kind of go through the pictures and identify the people. So using crowdsourcing, a tool that is normally associated with sort of liberation and sort of the utopian internet vision of freedom, using it for the opposite end. So again, the tools have changed and they empower people, but in some ways empower government.
So, the question occurred to me as you were talking. Well, okay, the French Revolution they did pretty well at gathering a crowd every now and then. They didn't do too badly in Moscow either back in 1917. So, what's the answer to that observation? Is it that they might have done it faster and better and quicker if they had these tools available to them today?
Sure, that's one answer.
Okay.
Certainly, it's not to say that protest was not possible before the internet.
Right.
Revolutions were not possible, or democratic, advocacy for democratic change wasn't possible. It was. I think it's putting more information into more people's hands and allowing them, without question, is power.
Yeah, and it does suggest actually that the threshold of dissatisfaction that results in some kind of political action is today probably a lot lower than it used to be. You'd have to be in real pain to want to go out and take a risk of revolting against the French or Tsarist regime as compared to...
Sure, that's probably...
Okay, all right, well, that's very interesting. So the next question, now you've talked about this a little bit, but how are you, maybe you could drill down into this, about how are you seeing repressive governments response to the internet? What actually are they doing?
I think for most of the internet's history, with respect to governments, it's kind of gone under the radar. And it's something that started in the U.S. The U.S. approach to it, regulatory approach to it was hands off. And that kind of this wild west of the internet kind of prevailed. You saw lots of activity, you saw all the growth, all the new companies, all the new services, and people getting connected to the internet around the world. Now, we've only got a couple billion people connected, and there are going to be 5 or 6 or pick a number, billion more connected over the next few years. So it's really going to change. But that's sort of what we've had. Now, governments have started to wake up and say, well, wait a minute, what about my sovereignty? Like, aren't I in charge here? And where they could regulate what people read or what they do, what kinds of content they see, and it's a lot harder to do that when someone's connected to the internet and go anywhere they want. So in many ways, with lots of governments, the internet's been threatened, and it's not just repressive governments. It's not just China or it's not just Iran. There are lots of governments like Russia, like Brazil, many places that have been, Korea, that have been very uneasy about the fact that lots of information is available, and their ability to sort of, impose whatever their local rules are and customs that they think are important to their society. It's been very hard for them to impose that on the internet. So what we're seeing is a lot more attempts to regulate the internet and to control it more and to bring it under some sort of government control and auspices. And that ranges from the extreme versions we see in China, where they block things. And we very famously decided that we couldn't live with Chinese censorship and we moved our search engine out of China. But it remains the case that most of our services are blocked in China. YouTube, things like that. You can't even access them. Facebook's not available in China. And I think we have services that are either partially or completely inaccessible in something like 35 countries. So we see that at the extreme. But what we're now seeing a lot more of is governments sort of coming up with laws and sort of taking a legislative approach to say, well, you know what, we're really worried about what children see. Or we're worried about child pornography or something like that. And they come up with sort of laws that, when you actually read them, allow them to do a lot more than that, right? So it's kind of well-intentioned laws that actually are written so broadly that they can mean almost anything. We have to dealing with one in Russia, sort of anything harmful to youth. Well, there's a lot of media out there that you could argue is harmful for youth. So what does that mean for someone who's a blogger who wants to say something critical? And a lot of it is driven by concerns about politicians of transparency, right? It turns out that the thing that, we deal with this in China, the thing that they get most upset about, yes, they get upset about if you're talking about Tiananmen Square or about Tibet or some of these things, but they really get upset if you talk about the local, the party officials and what they're up to. Right. So a lot of it is driven by that. But I think that, so we're seeing an increase in this kind of filtering, censoring, control, and we're very worried about it.
So, here's a question I asked with some trepidation as one of the former directors, the first director of national intelligence, but I don't think we can get through an election like this without it. So how have the revelations of global U.S. intelligence practices changed things? I think I'm opening up Pandora's box.
There you go. No, I mean, we're open about it. We talked about it. They have changed things. It's been these revelations were a surprise to us. In we're in this business. We did not think that these types of things were going on, certainly not with this review. And so there's obviously the paramount question of this balance between security and civil liberties, right, that we need to strike in our society, in a free society, that we're all wrestling with. And, as the disclosures come out, we're reeling from, each disclosure, but we're wrestling with that. But there's an economic component of this that I think is not being fully understood. The impact on the internet industry, the technology business, has been pretty severe, quite frankly. It's a business that depends on user trust. So it depends on the fact that if you're using Google, that we tell you that we're only going to use your information the way you want us to, but then the government can come in and take it at any time. And so people all around the world are concerned about that. People outside the United States are particularly concerned about because we're a U.S. company, that U.S. government can get access to everything. So it's really damaging for people to lose that trust in Google's ability to maintain, to safeguard that information. It's also created, it's added more fuel to the fire for some of these government efforts to control the internet around the world and to do things that would break the internet. A big problem that we've been seeing are governments that want to have what we call localization laws. The idea is that they're talking about this in Brazil, where if you want to have if a Brazilian user is using, say, your email service, you have to keep all the data in Brazil, right? And it's a thing that would break the internet. The internet is built so that it crosses these borders, that the data lives in many places for the world, and that's why it works seamlessly. So a lot of these things would really break the internet. So I'm saying, in addition to the civil liberties concerns, which are huge, and we need to really be thinking about whether we need to recalibrate, right, that balance. There's also, because the internet industry, the U.S. is the leading internet company, there's a real issue around the impact of that.
So this really raises, and you already mentioned, this question of localization requirements or balkanization, as they say. I take it you would argue, and I think probably correctly, that these revelations have perhaps exacerbated the tendencies of various countries towards wanting to balkanize things.
Yeah, no, so if you look at what the responses have been from some of the European countries, from Brazil and other places, it's been, well, wait a minute, we need to take this out of, if the U.S. government is just looking at everything, then maybe we need to break the internet up so it's not so global and controlled by the U.S., but it's more local. We call these splinter nets. So we go from an internet to a splinter net, where you have all of these kinds of regional things that are almost by definition not going to work as well. Because it turns out, strangely, that people, here I'm an American, I live in the United States, but I want to know what's going on and what people think about it in Australia, somewhere else, or in Africa. And so it's going to be hard to do. It's hard to interact with people across the internet. So it is definitely adding fuel to the fire there. It hasn't helped that we've been listening in on conversations with foreign leaders. It hasn't helped that we've had that the justification for it has often been couched as, well, don't worry, we're only snooping on foreigners. Right? For companies like ours, where most of our business and most of our users are non-Americans, right? It comes from outside the United States. It's not very helpful. So I think that it's been, again, it's a problem. But it's not one that we can't reverse. We take some steps to change the technology.
So when you also talked about the economic impact, I went to Silicon Valley a couple of times in connection with the Council on Foreign Relations task force on the future of the internet that I co-chaired with Sam Palmisano, the former CEO of IBM. And we met a number of companies that were saying they'd already felt an economic impact from these revelations. They'd already lost business. And I believe I saw something where Mr. Chambers today, the
Yeah,
CEO of Cisco,
Yeah.
said something in that.
Yeah, I mean,
So
a
it's
major technology company that today released their earnings and said they had a really bad quarter because in the emerging markets because of the NSA revelation that people not wanting to keep with. So it's tangible and we're starting to see.
Well, I think that's very important information, in addition to the question of espionage and human freedoms and so forth, surveillance. But I think there's probably, you'll find it easier, anyway, to reach some kind of convergence with policymakers, legislators, and so forth on the importance of trying to protect these vital economic interests.
Yeah, well, we hope that it enters into the equation. So when you're talking about, well, where do the balances, what's the balance we strike, how far do we go on the security side? That yes, you're talking about individual liberties, but yet you're also talking about economic impact.
So here's the question that occurs to me, and that you have, and I have. We've both participated in conversations with lawmakers and former lawmakers about this whole situation. And the sense I get is that everybody thinks that something has to change, at least somewhat, in the way we go out some of this intelligence collection activity. But do you think there's enough of that sentiment, and both publicly and amongst our government officials, both the legislative and executive branch, to actually come up with some meaningful change? Well, what's your view?
We're hopeful that there is. I think that there's legislation in Congress now that would deal with transparency. I mean, one of the big problems around this is how secret it is. Right, and it's very hard to inspire trust in a system where you don't know where the rules are secret, where the interpretations of the rules are secret, where the decisions, all of the decisions in the forum, it's all done in secret, and it's very hard for you to know what's going on. We are in the middle of some litigation with the government over our ability to disclose. We like to, when we get requests from government for information from us, we like to tell the world that we got the request, and we either complied with it or we didn't. We have this thing called the transparency report, where we do that for every government around the world, and we put that out periodically. We wanted to include these FISA court orders and requests that we get in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and because the way the law is written, our very receipt of those is confidential or is classified, so we can't even say that. And so we've been wanting to publish that, and we have some litigation around our ability to do that. The government responded to our petition with sort of a brief where the main argument for why it was damaging to national security for us to publish these, what we get, the numbers of these that we get, was redacted so that we couldn't even see them. And we were litigants in the case. Right? It's been very hard to make an counter-argument to something, an argument that you can't see. Right? So that's the level of secrecy that we're dealing with. And so I think that number one is to get more transparent about what's going on, how much activity there is, what the standards are, how the rules that we might all agree on are then being interpreted in order to collect information. So that's number one. Number two, it seems that a lot of us were very surprised by this bulk collection of data. In other words, that rather than having some if there's a terrorist cell you're investigating, you have a phone number, you go get that phone number, and then you figure out who that number is called, and then you kind of progress your investigation that way. What we found out is that we're getting records of every single call that everybody knows. Right, and then taking and putting it to the side and then sifting through it on their own later. That's not what most people think of as a sort of Fourth Amendment grounded kind of structure for collecting information. So I think we need to think about how we can restructure that and perhaps have some new rules that are appropriate for the digital age that strike the balance a little bit better. The bill Jim Simpson and Senator Leahy put out that is a good step in that direction.
So I mentioned earlier our Council on Foreign Relations Task Force report on the future of the Internet, and it was entitled Defending an Open, Global, Secure, and Resilient Internet. Regrettably, literally the day we issued this report earlier last summer, Mr. Snowden made his revelations, I think literally on the same day or the day after, so that I think the message of this report got slightly drowned out by all of the publicity. I think there's some good ideas in here which I commend to everyone, but okay. Have these revelations kind of shattered our hopes for an open, global, secure, and resilient Internet? I guess I would add to that question, what do you think needs to be done to protect Internet freedom? So that's the question before I open things up.
Sure, no, I'm still very hopeful that we can continue that fight. The thing is, that the United States was really the leader of this globally, right? Protecting Internet freedom, making sure that governments stay out of the Internet government solutions, or at least participate and control it. And the concern is that, these revelations have made it a lot harder for the United States to do. So I think what we need to do is something bold that makes it clear to the world that, we understand that perhaps this has gone too far, we're going to increase the transparency, we're going to change some of, reduce the scope of some of this collection, and make it clear that we're serious. On Internet freedom generally, I think we need to really get, start calling countries to account for regulating the Internet. The U.S. has been starting to do this, but I don't think we do enough. It's not as if there isn't already, an international accord that countries have signed on to that ought to cover this. Right? If you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19, it talks about, and I'm paraphrasing, but it talks about the ability of people that need to be protected for them to receive information, regardless of media and across frontiers. So while that was written in 1947, 1948, it seems to have been written with the Internet in mind, right? Across frontiers, regardless of media. And most of the countries in the world haven't signed on to that, right? We should find a way to enforce that from a human rights perspective. But in addition to that, and if that's too hard, it turns out that it's funny to tell you how hard it is to get countries together on human rights issues. We have trade issues, right? Censorship is a trade barrier. And if you think, if you look at China, what they're up to, yes, they want political control, but they also want to favor local Chinese internet companies over foreign ones. And that's a big part of what drives their content restriction regime. So we can go into these trade negotiations and say, look, we can't have these data localization provisions. We need to have an open internet. We need to allow information to flow across borders if you want to be part of the global trade community. That's doable. We're always negotiating trade agreements around the world. That ought to be a priority. Internet freedom ought to be a major priority in this talk. That's a tangible way, a very practical way in which we can get internet freedom, secure internet freedom going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's very true indeed. I mean, localization and balkanization are just another form of import substitution and protection. It's just different guys with respect to a different field. One of the recommendations we made in our task force report was focused on intellectual property and the stealing, the poaching of intellectual property, and we made the recommendation, which I think has quite a wide degree of acceptance, of including those kinds of issues in trade discussions and trade agreements, because that's not a bad place to talk about intellectual property. There are already chapters both on intellectual property and on e-commerce. I think the issue of online stealing of
yeah, I mean, in fairness, I think Hollywood has been very good historically in getting that property, that budget into those discussions. We've been less successful in getting internet freedom into those discussions. I hope we can do that.
Although I must tell you, when Jack Valenti used to run the Motion Picture Association of America, and you were an American ambassador. You were usually ducked because he was so ferocious and tenacious in the pursuit of his objective. Now, yes, he was very effective, and Krista is as well. So now, why don't we open it up to some? There's a question back there. I guess, do we have a circulating microphone, or do you just have to shout? Go ahead.
You were speaking a little before about,
You got to speak up, though.
okay, you were speaking before about the vital roles and open access plays to the internet on the global scale. Recently you have the case with Verizon Wireless and the DC Circuit Court regarding to net neutrality, basically. And the ability for ISPs like Verizon to surcharge companies like Yahoo, Google, Netflix, other technology companies like that for their use of the internet. To surcharge them for the use of the internet and things like that. And basically having a pipeline, basically kind of changing the pipeline for that access. What's your take on that, and how does that affect, democratization through internet access?
Sure. Questions about net neutrality and so forth. Look, I think it's pretty important that, having microphone problems again,
Could I ask everybody to keep their conversation down?
Sure. But we have to make sure that there are no sort of toll keepers on the internet that can sort of, for their own commercial purposes, decide what goes over the internet, what gets to go over, what doesn't get to go over. I think that some of that's been, I think the way the business is shaping out and the markets are shaping out in terms of internet access and broadband and so forth, I think a lot of this is getting resolved through kind of business. It turns out that internet access is a really good business for Verizon and AT&T. They're in that business. They think it's a great business, and they want to work with people like Google, who do things like you do, which is why people get the internet access, right, so they can use all these services. So I really think that that's the way forward there, that these business relationships will ultimately carry the day and work out. But if it appears that telcos are in fact doing this kind of toll, this sort of gatekeeping in an unfair way, the rules ought to prohibit that.
Yes, sir, right next to it.
Thank you for recognizing my question. My name is Benjamin Dees, and I'm representing the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana. And my question is in regards to social media. To what extent would you label social media as being a tool in the arsenal of democracy versus social media being as a tool for intolerance and malicious propaganda? I know this was a topic earlier about organizations such as Al-Qaeda or other malicious institutions using social media to further their cause, and how can we as citizens combat that aspect of social media to use it as a tool for democracy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, again, it's speech, right? And we think as a democratic society, free society, we believe that expression is good. We believe that platforms for expression are good. And what that means, though, is there's a lot of bad speech, right? And that people can use it for good ends, they can use it for ends that aren't so positive. But we want to make sure that we allow that within limits, right? And you can't cite people that do harm others and so forth. We have First Amendment jurisprudence that does that really well. But I think in the end, when you look at social media, maybe what's not appreciated enough, or what we don't do enough of, is counter speech, right? And you get people who are doing crazy things on the internet, saying stupid things and comment boards and whatever. What we need to do is make it easier for people who are more reasonable, right, to counter that, right? And the best answer to offensive speech is more and better speech, right, on the other side. So I think that's a big part of the answer. And the fact that you have a right to say something, that's negative doesn't mean that you don't get to bear the sort of consequences of that. And anonymity on the internet is problem in this regard, right? Because you don't have to, no one has to know who you are when you say things that are not productive. And so I think we need to find ways for people to really, to express it, to counter this kind of speech. And so everybody can look at it and decide for themselves.
So there's a uniform, there you are. Are you one of the midshipmen?
Yes, sir, I am.
Okay, please go ahead.
How's it going, sir? Midshipman United States Naval Academy. You spoke about how internet access needs to be a part of international relations negotiations in order to promote freedom. Do you foresee Google becoming a global non-state actor through providing information to states such as the North Korean people in order to affect domestic political stability?
So I'm sorry, I didn't catch the middle. You see Google as a...
Do you foresee Google becoming a global non-state actor to affect political stability in states such as North Korea?
Well, look, I don't think we're a state actor or a non-state actor in politics. And we're not looking to get into politics. But we think is good for the world is to have platforms for people to communicate, and for people to get information and get access to information. Where you have governments that are cutting that off and making it hard for their people to do that, sure, we want to contribute to the solution, and we want to contribute to ways around that, because we think fundamentally that people have a right to information and have a right to use services like ours.
Gentleman in the white shirt over there, if you could get the mic to him. And, yes, sir.
Hi, thank you for this great enlightening talk. My name is Patrick Taryn. I'm from Columbus, Ohio, the Council on World Affairs there. So first the world was flat, then it was round, then it was flat again. Now there is no world because it's just all in the cloud. And which makes protecting the cloud ever more important. And I remember reading recently that the Swiss are considering, since they have the brand of being the most discreet, secretive, privacy-oriented, Swiss bank accounts and all that, are hoping to use that brand to take the cloud and protect it after all the NSA outcomes. Because most of the companies doing the cloud are U.S.-based companies. So maybe you could comment on that and whether that's a realistic trajectory for the Swiss.
Yeah, I don't know how realistic it is, but it's troubling, right, that meme is out there in the wake of this, right? I mean, you can see how there might be other countries that have so far not been the home for major internet companies or cloud-based computing companies to say, aha, here's a business plan, right? People care about privacy, people care about the government not surveilling them. Why don't we try to be the home for places where the U.S. government can't get at it, figure out some way to build walls around it. I don't know how successful that'll be, but I think that's all the more reason why we need to, in the U.S., sort of get back on the right foot on these issues, so that people can trust the balance that we're striking here between privacy and security and liberty and security. Again, because as I said, big impact for cloud computing. Most of the biggest cloud computing companies are American companies. I don't think we're moving anywhere, so we're here. Amazon is here. Facebook, Yahoo, same thing. And we're all global companies. So I think that it's something we really got to get our hands around. Lest we have sort of this kind of competition, which might be positive, but I don't know.
So we have time for one last question. It's a gentleman right by the movie camera, the video camera there. Give him the mic.
Again, thank you for your speech today. I'm Ed Martins from Will Boston. And my question is how much control do the governments really have? It seems to be your average bright 12 or 13 will get about most of these walls and protections and things like that. And they can try doing what you call splinter nets. Thank you. I've never heard that word. Write it down. And but any of these governments have any plans, their businesses, they say, listen, we have to be out there, we have to be, exporting. Every government, with the exception of maybe North Korea, is trying to exploit a part of that, so the government can't do that. And they can try to, my first is just basically, how good are those filters?
Well, I think keep in mind, it's not just a technical question, it's a technical and a legal question, right? And so, yes, the government might not be able to, 100% of the time stop you from getting around whatever technical measures they come up with for censorship. But they might have laws that say that if you do it, we'll throw you in jail. Right, and if they can trace who you are, and in most cases they probably can by going to the local, wherever you got your internet access, and find out who you are, and they're getting ever more sophisticated in doing that, and they can throw you in jail, that chills that behavior, right? So I think governments are becoming better actually at using the combination of technical filtering measures and actually laws to try to impose some of these things. And on the trade issue, look, that's my point, is that countries like the U.S. need to start putting more pressure on countries to uphold internet freedom as part of their trade negotiations. Right now, I think people are able to participate in trade without guaranteeing that there's freedom for the citizens of the internet.
So we're about to wind up here. Is there any sort of final observation or final comments you'd like to make before we conclude? It's very, very interesting discussion.
No, this is great. Thank you all. Thanks for the great questions. We will remain incredibly optimistic about the role of the internet, both in terms of freedom and in terms of economic growth and opportunity. So it's great to be here.
Please join me in thanking David.